Good afternoon, good evening, and good morning. We're spanning many time zones today. Welcome to the Global Interdependence Center College of Central Bankers program on Federal Reserve Bank independence and the divided U.S. Congress. On behalf of the Global Interdependence Center's Board of Directors, welcome to today's executive briefing. I'm Peter Gold, Chair of GIC's College of Central Bankers and Vice Chair of the GIC Board. Today's executive briefing is a special College of Central Bankers presentation. The College of Central Bankers provides a platform for former leaders of the world, central banks, and similar institutions to share their unique combination of hands-on experience and continued thought leadership on important global issues facing economies and affecting the quality of life. Thank you to Ali Hushman today from Rowan University, Richard Aller from the TheGoldGroup, Gold Aller Real Estate Investment Firm. We're very appreciative of their support for this program and support for the College of Central Bankers. The College of Central Bankers has several initiatives that include internal surveys, institutional alignment projects, a number of private roundtable discussions with GIC members and sponsors. Over the next 90 minutes, we will explore the realities and risks of political influence in selecting Federal Reserve governors, regional bank leaders, and others around the globe. This program exemplifies one of the core reasons for the College of Central Bankers. All the college fellows are former leaders of central banks, and perhaps now they are a bit less constrained in expressing their views. With that, I'm so pleased to introduce today's moderator, Michael McKee, International Economics and Policy Correspondent for Bloomberg TV and Radio, and a member of the College of Central Bankers Advisory Board. For those of you who follow Mike, you will know that he is the very best at his craft. With that, welcome, Mike. Welcome to you all. I'll turn the floor over to you, Mike.
Thank you very much, Peter, and welcome to our panel, very distinguished panel. I was thinking this week, for those of you who've been watching me on Bloomberg Television, I've been talking to a number of Fed officials about what their plans are, and so that's sort of the college starting lineup. Now we're going to go to the alumni club, the people who were the all-stars in the past, but who have a long institutional history with the Federal Reserve and have a very good idea about Fed independence and sometimes the lack thereof. I don't think I need to go into lengthy introductions for all of these people, but I'll just mention that joining us today is Dr. Jeffrey Lockhart. He was the head of the Federal Reserve Bank of Richmond for 12 years. He's now a distinguished professor of economics at the Virginia Commonwealth University School of Business. Dennis Lockhart spent a decade as the president of the Atlanta Federal Reserve Bank. He is now retired, but consulting. And Charlie Plosser, was formerly the Philadelphia Fed Bank president, and he is now a board member for FINRA, and he also does consulting. He's on the FINRA Board of Governors. I think we all, those of us who have had a long and intensive relationship with the Federal Reserve know that the Fed is very, very defensive about being independent. But what does that always mean? We're going to have to get into that with these three gentlemen here today. For those who know their history, of course, the Fed didn't start out as independent. It started out under the thumb of the Treasury Department, and it took some 40 years before it moved out from underneath that. And there are still efforts to bring it back. And there are some done by the Fed itself over the past couple of crises. So what we thought we'd do is start with a little history from Charlie Plosser, who has written a very interesting paper about Fed independence. And we'll hear from Jeff and Dennis as they make opening statements as well. And then we'll get into the questioning part of our program. So Charlie, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Mike. And welcome everybody who's with us today. It's a pleasure for me to be here, and particularly a pleasure to be sitting on a panel with my classmates, so to speak, and my former colleagues, Dennis and Jeff. Dennis and I sat right next to each other for 8 years or so as at the FOMC table, and Jeff was just one seat away from us. So maybe it was the bad boys end of the table. I'm not quite sure how you think about that. But in any event, it's a pleasure to be here with all of you. I thought I would kind of elected to kick off this session and talk a little bit about background about central bank independence, a little history, a little bit about how I think about it, and maybe some of the challenges too. So let me start. Well, what do economists mean when they talk about central bank independence? Well, for the most part, economists think about it somewhat more narrowly than the Fed or a central bank just being totally independent. You can do whatever it wants. They're really focusing on monetary policy decision-making, and that it's very important for monetary policy to be independent of the day-to-day phrase of politics. Why is that? Well, most of the reason is because central banks around the world, in most our countries, have the responsibility of ensuring price level stability. It's one of their mandates and one of their primary mandates. And in fact, in most countries, it is the central bank that is responsible for stabilizing the price level or price stability in some point. And the stress is that monetary policy needs to be kept free of short-run political considerations so it can continue to focus on its longer-term goals. Now, the case really for independence hinges around two things. One, I've already mentioned, the important and unique role that central banks play in providing price stability. The second central role that complicates the picture and why it's important is that central banks often play a role in financing government expenditures. Most of you realize that, when the government spends money, it has to either get it from raising taxes, issuing debt, which are just future taxes, or, as we all know, printing money. It's very clear that there's a conflict arises between the fiscal authorities and the monetary authorities when it comes to the government budget constraint and how it funds its activities and how it achieves its goals. The classic example of this, of course, is what Mike referred to, and that is the 1951 Treasury Fed Accord. Through most of World War II, the Fed followed a practice of what we call pegging the interest rate. That is, it set the interest rate on government bonds. That was partly driven by World War II. But in any event, it meant that the Fed was responsible for essentially buying government debt at whatever rate was necessary to keep the interest rate fixed. Now, of course, what happened is that after price controls came off after World War II and capital controls came off and the war was over, the U.S. faced a period of fairly rapid inflation and volatile inflation. And it came to a head in 1951 because the Fed said to President Truman and the Secretary of Treasury, look, we cannot attack and solve the inflation problem when we're tied to fixing the interest rate on government bonds. We cannot continue to do fiscal policy and also achieve our mandate for price stability. And it was quite an acrimonious debate, actually, that lasted several years. But in 1951, there was what we call the 51 Accord, which gave the Fed, in essence, the freedom to control its own balance sheet and not have it tied to the federal government's debt management practices. That is the impetus and one of the milestones, if you would say, in the Fed becoming an independent central bank, and it still stands as that. But independence about monetary policy doesn't mean independence about everything. In fact, you really can't have an independent institution like the Fed that's really independent completely. the institutional relationship between the Fed and Congress, let's say, has to have constraints. It has to have limitations. There needs to be some form of constraints because, as I've already alluded to, governments oftentimes resort to the printing press to avoid difficult fiscal decisions. And that undermines monetary policy's primary responsibility for ensuring price stability. So there's a good reason for this separation between monetary policy and fiscal policy, or the fiscal authorities. And what we know is that without some form of constraints in a democratic society, that there has to be some limits or constraints on both the monetary authorities, the central bank, and on Congress in some ways, in order to make the central bank both accountable and preserve its independence. Because if they're not constrained and the Fed is free to do whatever it wants to do anytime it wants to, that's not accountability. And that makes for challenges and these conflicts of interest between the monetary and fiscal authorities. And independence tries to control that in some way. And central banks are controlled in many ways. For example, one way you can think about controlling a central bank is limit its mandate to a narrow, very specific set of goals that it can achieve and that it can be held accountable for. That's one way to limit its activities. And of course, that means that narrow mandates tend to be preferred to broad, vague mandates, because broad, vague mandates actually leave the door open for central banks to do all sorts of things in the name of those mandates, which may not be very desirable and also run into conflicts with the fiscal authorities. Another type of control that governments put on central banks is the kind of assets they can buy, for example. The Fed has restrictions on the kind of assets it can buy and under what circumstances it can buy them. So there's another form of constraint. So it's important that we think about independence and we think about it in the realm of what's feasible and what makes sense in the context of our society. How to retain effectiveness of the central bank, but also protect its independence by constraining the range of activities that it actually can independently engage itself for. And there are examples of that, but I don't have time to do that. I guess the last point I'd like to make is that there's always been some tension, obviously, between the fiscal authorities and the monetary authorities. And it is certainly true these days and has actually gotten somewhat more problematic since 2007, 2008. But we do need limitations, and the question is struggling to how to figure out what those are and how to frame it. There are some people, though, who argue today that independence is some kind of arcane concept that's outlived its usefulness. Well, what we know is, I disagree with that pretty soundly. We know from history that independence, countries that have independence under banks tend to have lower inflation, they tend to have more transparency, and they tend to function better in general. But an interesting type of I
think we may have lost Charlie there. We'll see if he unfreezes for a moment. And in the meantime, why don't I bring either Dennis or Jeffrey in here? Dennis, you want to start offering some of your comments, and we'll see if we can get Charlie back.
All right. Thank you very much, Mike. Charlie's actually touched on a couple of things I want to touch on. But let me start. Jeff and Charlie will remember the so-called Fed disclaimer, where we always said at the beginning of every speech that we were speaking for ourselves only. These are our personal views. They do not reflect necessarily the views of the Federal Reserve System, blah, blah, blah. I'd like to start with a similar disclaimer. These are my personal views based on conversations and readings and observations. I could be wrong about some of what I'm going to say, but very much a personal set of concerns. As Charlie kind of pointed out, the Fed is a creature of Congress, and Congress is charged with overseeing the Fed, and the Fed enjoys independence in the setting of monetary policy, but in other important responsibilities, the payment system, supervision and regulation, community development activities, and so forth, Congress exercises a fairly strong oversight and can do so if it chooses without seeming to encroach on the prerogatives of the central bank. So it's the independence in the formulation of monetary policy that I believe is the central concern. And I thought I would talk a little bit about the stakes involved, and I'll start with a personal anecdote. Over 50 years ago, when I began a banking career in the international group of what is now Citigroup, it was Citibank back then, I attended training sessions on country risk evaluation. And I remember quite vividly one of the lessons by one of the graybeards of the bank who had worked at the IMF and perhaps the World Bank. And he basically said, when you're evaluating a country, the first place you go is the central bank, and more specifically, you go to the central bank's balance sheet. And if the growth of that balance sheet appears to be under political influence, so the ruling politicians are actually dictating the course of monetary policy, you don't increase your exposure to the country, you may short the currency, and you watch that country with great wariness. So it was drummed into my head that central bank independence in the formulation of monetary policy is really the central question. So I'd like to frame my remarks around the question that, given a divided Congress, given the polarized nature of our politics, and given the way that politicians today practice the profession of politics, is the Fed's independence in the formulation of monetary policy more or less in jeopardy? How are things trending around the Fed's independence in monetary policy setting? Which way are the winds blowing? And I'd like to paint a picture that suggests that some of the winds are blowing in an unfavorable direction, and more so than in some years past. So let me begin this discussion by saying that the Board of Governors and the Reserve Banks have a function that's called Community and Economic Development. And a few years back, there was some pressure that built from Capitol Hill and from the public to do more about community development and more about workforce development. And this amounted to, and has amounted to, the Fed increasingly involving itself in what you might call social issues. All of the reserve banks, and this was presumably with the blessing of the Board of Governors, signed on to efforts in research and in their convening powers around issues such as inequality, inclusion, the effect of racism on the economy, the causes of poverty at a more micro level, regional, or even a neighborhood level, and similar concerns. Also, at certain reserve banks, there has been a step up in focus on climate change. A few of the reserve banks have been particularly active, and a conference and speaker series was undertaken that was called Racism and the Economy. Now, I didn't personally attend any of these sessions, any of these forums, so all of my impressions are secondhand, but I was led to understand that at some of the forums, rather aggressive viewpoints that are consistent with the emotional time in which we live have been expressed. And to support this stepped up focus of the Fed and the reserve banks, connections and partnerships have been forged with outside advocacy groups. And it's my belief that the perception exists in some quarters on Capitol Hill that the Fed, which has historically been a rather measured, research-oriented entity, may have tipped over into more advocacy. Now, Congress has been paying attention, and I'll mention particularly, because I know we have on the call a number of residents of the state of Pennsylvania, particularly Senator Toomey, the senator from Pennsylvania and the ranking member on the Senate Banking Committee. So the perspective on one side of the aisle, at least, is that the Fed is undergoing some mission creep, somewhat getting out of its lane and doing stuff that is only loosely connected to its mandate. Then along comes the recent spike in inflation. So recent criticism has been along the lines of the Fed is paying attention to social issues, not inflation. I can imagine that there's been communication between Senator Toomey's office and others on the Hill and Chair Powell and the Fed more generally expressing these concerns. It's also my impression that Chair Powell and the Fed are listening and have digested these concerns and are, in all likelihood, considering how to respond and whether some adjustments, what you might call operating adjustments, are called for. It's important to remember that the Fed banks, the Fed reserve banks, enjoy substantial freedom of action. And although they will take on board suggestions from Chair Powell, and especially the Board of Governors, they're not obligated really to respond, at least automatically respond. So to conclude, when I was in my 10 years at the Atlanta Fed, we would explain that the Fed's overall objective was to treat anything that affects the vitality of the economy for all Americans. And I want to emphasize, it's a big challenge to define the research and the outreach agenda of the system and of each reserve bank when there are clearly aspects of the vitality of the economy that pertain to inequality, inclusion, and social justice. But that said, to answer the question that I posed at the beginning, which way are the winds blowing? I see, and I expect Fed leadership sees, that the core principle of independence and the setting of monetary policy may have become more intertwined recently with other activities within the system, at least in the last couple of years. And I hope that the leadership might consider some efforts to bring this into balance to protect that independence. This is purely my opinion, and it's probably fair to say, as regards Congress, that much depends on upcoming electoral outcomes. So, Mike, let me conclude my remarks there.
Thank you, Dennis. Jeff, you have some opening thoughts?
Yeah, I'd like to talk about credit and credit markets and the Fed's role there. Let me first start by thanking the Global Interdependence Center and Peter Gold and Jill Fernito for organizing this and inviting me to participate with my good friends and old former colleagues. Credit policy, Fed's involvement in credit markets is a key dimension of Fed independence, plays a key role here. I want to say I endorse wholeheartedly the adoption of a credit accord that might limit the Fed's role in credit markets, as Charlie Plosser's proposed in a draft that's circulated, I understand. This proposal originated from my former colleague at the Richmond Federal Reserve Bank, the late Marvin Goodfriend. It's based on the idea that for the conduct of monetary policy, it is entirely sufficient for the Federal Reserve to operate only in Treasury securities, avoiding lending to any private entities. The idea is for the Federal Reserve to supply the market as a whole with the appropriate and sufficient quantity of bank reserves, and to let the market participants reallocate those reserves to their best and highest use, taking into account the complete panoply of risk considerations. Satisfying a surge in demand for bank reserves in a crisis, a surge in the demand for central bank money in a crisis, is exactly what Walter Bagehot was advocating for the Bank of England when he urged them to lend freely in a financial crisis. So from this point of view, this idea that the central bank should serve as a lender of last resort is really a misleading way to phrase it. It really ought to be thought of as the idea that a central bank should serve as the monetary instrument supplier of last resort. And these are monetary instruments that, after all, the Fed and other central banks generally have legal monopolies on the supply of. And they're obligated to supply them in a way that's appropriate from the point of view of their price stability mission. That was Bagehot's insight. Marvin's insight is that the lending part wasn't really essential for lender of last resort. It's really that their liabilities they create when they purchase securities or make loans is really the operative thing for Bagehot. And I think that's very true. And I think the historical record's very clear on that. Marvin's insight about the political economy of central bank, where his insights were acute, perceptive, and I still draw on them. He saw that central bank credit allocation is inherently distributional because it's subsidized and involves discretionary choice by the central bank in how to use its balance sheet. Thus, central bank credit allocation, involvement in credit markets, lending to private entities is inherently controversial. It's inherently political, and it's likely to be quite partisan. I think that this was evident in 2009 and 2010 and the years after in the political blowback that the Federal Reserve got from both ends of the political spectrum about the way it handled the financial crisis. And I think some of the way it handled spring of 2020 seemed geared to answering some of those critiques. An example this morning arose of the kind of distributional issues that are at stake. Governor Chris Waller, formerly of the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis, gave a speech about housing markets. And in it, he noted something interesting. So the Federal Reserve, since early 2020, has been buying U.S. Treasury securities and mortgage-backed securities. According to Waller, Fed board staff economists estimate that the mortgage-backed securities that the Fed has undertaken since early 2020 have lowered mortgage-backed security yields and thus lowered mortgage rates, presumably, by 40 basis points. Now, an implication of that you might not notice at first blush, and might seem a little opaque, is that if the Fed had bought treasuries instead of that slug of mortgage-backed securities, yes, mortgage rates would be 40 basis points higher, but other borrowing rates would be lower. So the Fed, by deciding to buy mortgage-backed securities, is causing mortgage rates to be lower than they otherwise would, and other borrowers to pay more than they otherwise would. This is laid out in a transcript from sometime in the last decade. I'd have to dig to find it for you, but as part of that discussion, very clear in the staff's analysis. So here's a case where the Fed's choice about getting into housing markets has clear distributional implications. Marvin argued that the Fed should conserve its political capital for use in defense of unpopular monetary policy actions that might be necessary to preserve price stability, but might involve short-term pain in the form of higher unemployment rates. This is what the Fed's independence is for. Latent in Charlie's remarks, the Fed's independence is for use in defending unpopular monetary policy actions. So a comment about the Accord in 1951, a key feature of that goes less widely remarked than you might think, is that the Fed had the support of key senators against Truman. If Truman had the support of senators, the battle that led to the Accord might not have turned out in a way that delivered Fed independence. What independence means to me is broad political support for the Fed's ability to take unpopular monetary policy actions that are necessary to preserve price stability. You want that support. If you have that support, let's call it independence. Congress is going to be happy, the political system is going to be happy to let the Fed pursue those unpopular actions. The Fed seems likely to get a test very soon of its ability to defend unpopular monetary policy actions that might have deleterious effects on the labor market. So we'll see how this test fares. I'll end with a small example that illustrates the connection between credit policy and monetary policy independence. And it concerns the time when the Fed financed the Washington Metro, little known episode in the 1970s. And here's how it happened. In 1966, the Fed caused a credit crunch. In reaction, Congress slipped into the Federal Reserve Act authorization for the Federal Reserve to buy the securities, the debt of any agency of the United States, or to buy securities backed by or guaranteed by any agency of the United States. That includes Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. The FOMC was very reluctant to do so, but they were under a tremendous pressure from Congress to do something, to buy them. And so the Fed did some RPs, some repos in trade agency debt, but they came under more pressure. William Proxmire explicitly threatened to change the Federal Reserve Act in a way that reduced the Fed's independence. So Burns and the Fed caved in 1971 and started buying a lot of agency securities. In 1976 and 77, the FOMC became really uncomfortable with these, and a subcommittee headed by Paul Volcker, who was then at the New York Fed, investigated their holdings of these agency securities. And they had a lot of little miscellaneous agency securities in there, including securities issued by the Washington Metropolitan Area Transit Authority, which is, of course, the agency that built the Washington Metro. So the FOMC adopted a policy statement that said that its role in housing was not to allocate credit. Its role in these agency markets was not to engage in credit allocation. And shortly thereafter, it started rolling off its holdings of all of these things, including the MBS. So I would just note that the Fed's engagement in housing securities and its withdrawal from the market for housing securities, from credit allocation in that sense, coincided with the erosion of its credibility for price stability and the restoration of its credibility for price stability. Could be a coincidence. I would guess not. So I'll just leave you with that.
Thank you, Jeff. We move now into some questions. I'll ask some questions. We'll get some in from the audience. As I listen to all of you and thinking back on the years that I've covered the Fed, I'm curious as to the effect you think that the political aspects of Fed behavior have had. And I mean it in this sense. You can understand why in a world war, the Fed might be working with Treasury. You can understand certainly when we had the great inflation, why the Fed was called on to act and do something about it. Obviously, the great financial crisis and then the pandemic. So I'm wondering how much of it is a political bias that is based on a social reason that the Fed does things, or does the crisis make the Fed? In other words, is it that the Fed ends up maybe wandering over the line because it feels it has no choice to deal with an immediate emergency? Anybody want to take a crack at that?
Well, Micah, your question brings to mind the period that I was at the Fed, which was 2007 to 2017. And of course, that spanned the great financial crisis and the Great Recession that followed that. And for much of that period, and I would say continuing to this day, when the country faces a crisis of some kind and is looking for someone who can take action, we have, unfortunately, a legislative political system that I think is somewhat accurately described as dysfunctional and unable to take action. So all eyes go to what one author called the only game in town, or the only adults in the room. And unfortunately, that has been the Fed, where the Fed has had the capacity to act and other government institutions have not. And I think that means the crisis, in a way, comes to the Fed, and the temptation to step outside of historic, let's just say, lanes of activity, or the pressure to do that, has been very great.
Charlie, I'm wondering if that means that the ideas, and I'll ask Jeff as well, Marvin's ideas about changing the sort of the accord and trying to take the Fed out of some of these things is really possible, in the sense that some crisis is going to come up and everybody's going to turn to the then chairman of the Fed and say, what are you going to do about it? And drag them right back into a debate, because of course nobody on Capitol Hill is ever satisfied with what the Fed does.
I think there's some truth to that, Mike. Of course, history says that the Fed usually is more than willing to step in, maybe even when it can't do much about it. Excuse me. I think the danger here is this is sort of an incentive problem. If Congress always believes that the Fed will step in, whether the Fed has the appropriate tools to act or not, or whether they can actually do anything about it, there's a temptation for the Congress to say, we don't want to make these hard decisions, let the Fed do it. And that precipitates a kind of dysfunctional, if you will, assignment of decision rights, when there really are political decisions as much as economic decisions. So I think that the only way you can put pressure on both the Congress and the Fed to behave responsibly is to articulate the consequences. So, for example, and the paper I wrote, again, following in part the lead of, part the lead of Marvin, I argued back in 2008 that what the Fed should do with its lending programs is not do the lending, but help the Treasury do the lending. And then when the lending was done, have the Congress and the Treasury take it all off the Fed's books. So the Fed should be a facilitator of help, but ultimately the legal responsibility and the political responsibility rest for fiscal policy, as Jeff was talking about, which is credit policy, should rest with Congress, not the Fed. So there's got to be some disciplining mechanisms here to make sure that the parties act in a responsible way. But yes, there's pressure. The Fed has been more than willing to step up, even when it couldn't do anything about the problem. And I think it would be better for the Fed to say, no, we can't do that. The conflict I see I often write about this, was in 2008, in December, two senators wrote to Chair Bernanke and asked if the Fed would lend money to the automobile companies. They were in danger of failure. They were having a crisis. And Ben said, no, that's not our responsibility. That was the correct answer. But the credibility for that answer, or his own, the Fed's credibility in that answer, was undermined by the Fed's previous decisions to bail out Bear Stearns and AIG. Is it any wonder that Congress thought that, well, they'll bail out AIG and they'll bail out rescue Bear Stearns? Why won't they do the automobile companies or the jet engine companies, or pick your favorite industry? So I think the danger of crossing the line is undermining its own independence to make those kinds of decisions.
Jeff, you were on the Fed at the time when the Fed bailed out Bear Stearns and then did not bail out Lehman Brothers. When a future Fed official looks at that, is he going to say, you know, oh, we saw how horrible it was after the Lehman Brothers collapse, and we want to avoid that in the future, even if they don't have explicit written instructions from Congress, because Congress hasn't been able to figure out what it wants to do? Are we still going to be tempted?
You put your finger on the tough sort of configuration of political incentives that Federal Reserve officials face in what you might call financial crises. So the Fed has an independent balance sheet, like, you know, any central bank, a publicly chartered bank. The profits and losses flow back through to the Treasury. So it's a public institution. It's not, you know, it's not the case that profit and loss or risk characteristics drive its decision making. It's driven by, in some sense, predominantly these sort of accountability incentives having to do with the political system and how they view it. The Fed is always going to be a tempting institution to go to for the political system to go to in a crisis, because they're for the Fed to lend, it's an end run around the provisions of the Constitution that have to do with appropriating public funds. Now that those provisions mean you have to get a political coalition together to pass what you want to do. But I mean, the CARES Act is this great counterexample to the notion that only the Fed can act with sufficient haste. You know, that was organized and passed in very short order because there was a broad political consensus. Broad political consensus for rescuing Lehman probably wasn't going to be there. In fact, it definitely wasn't, because Hank Paulson and the Republicans didn't want to do it. I think there's a danger of learning the wrong lesson from Lehman. Between Lehman and Bear, one of them was surely wrong. The popular narrative is that Lehman was wrong, but I think a good case can be made that Bear was wrong, and that Bear, the way the Fed handled Bear, provided the incentive for Lehman to dance close to the edge of the cliff. I mean, they turned down capital injection offers because they didn't like the pricing. And it's sort of documented that the CEO thought that, there was widely thought that the Fed would and the Treasury would intervene to support them. So, what happened after Lehman is a consequence of, I think you have to calculate in there what Paulson and Bernanke said to Congress to try and motivate Congress to pass the TARP legislation. And they deliberately said about scaring the bejesus out of our political leadership. You're talking about Depression 2.0, meltdown. There won't be a financial system. There won't be an economy on Monday. I mean, the congressional leadership was an audience, but so was the rest of the country. So everyone stopped spending money. So I think you have to be careful about evaluating the fallout from Lehman. But in a crisis, and I know this was true in Bear, the Fed can act or not. And if it doesn't act and there's some turmoil, people can blame the Fed for the turmoil. And that fear is often what motivates the Fed to act, even though when it acts and it lends, it's the functional equivalent of the Treasury issuing the security and using that money to lend.
Dennis, when you look back and you think about the criticisms that the Fed got, and you were sitting around the table, how much did you anticipate and debate about the idea of, well, we're going to cross the line into becoming fiscal agents? That seems to be more of the political aspect of it than whether you were adopting a Republican or Democratic idea. But was that a major concern? And should you have taken a different tack?
It was a major concern. I remember considerable discussion of where the line might be drawn. I remember colleagues like Jeff Lacker being very vocal on this subject. I'm sympathetic to the shoes that Ben Bernanke stood in. I think it was his assessment that we were facing a systemic financial crisis, and to some degree, action needed to be taken that might cross some of those lines that are the lines are drawn in more abstract discussion of the way the world ought to be, but at the time having to deal with the way the world was and the risks involved with a great deal of uncertainty ahead. But yes, there was lots of discussion. I'm not prone to a whole lot of money morning quarterbacking of decisions that were made. It's a principle in my thinking that you have to put yourself back into that context at the time and the uncertainties that decision makers are facing. And I think the committee came out as making some legally justified or legally valid, aggressive moves considering the exigent circumstances. And then historians can go to work to claim whether that was right or wrong. I think the ultimate result of getting out of the financial crisis of 2008 and getting through a recession that wasn't terribly long validates that some good decisions were made. They were not all correct decisions, but good decisions were made.
Charlie, I'm wondering, you go back many years, one of the criticisms that Marvin had was that a lot of what the Fed had been doing was opaque. And then starting in 1994, Alan Greenspan started opening up the Fed, making it much more transparent. And you could argue about whether it's transparent enough today or not. But do you think that has changed the calculation about what the Fed can do, because it's now explained much more to the general public?
I think the answer to that is probably yes. I think transparency is a good thing. I remember I was having a conversation with Paul Volcker back in 2015, actually 14, 15. And he said he was taught something by the great central banker from the UK, Montague Norman, and or maybe it's Montague Norman, right? That's his name. And he said he was taught that the first rule of a central banker is never explain and never apologize. Well, I think the Fed operated for a long time with that as a as a pretty good description of how they behaved. And there's still a lot of that around, although the push to transparency, I think, has been a good thing. And the Fed has worked very hard at being transparent. There's no question about that. I don't want to take that away from them because it's really important. But the value of transparency, in part, is having to be held accountable for your decision making. And since the Fed is a public institution in some sense, and responsible to Congress and the public, the demand on them to be transparent is very important and does impact their decisions, as it should. However, that doesn't mean that drives all your decisions. I mean, it doesn't mean that just because you're transparent means you can't, as Jeff was saying, you can't take the stand about what may be unpopular. It's not about making popular decisions. It's about making the best decision you can at the time. And I certainly understand that. So yes, I think that part of the problem is that the Fed, I think, I agree with Jeff, and I said back in 2009, I thought the bigger challenge was not that Lehman was allowed to fail. I thought the mistake was actually Bear Stearns, because my own view is that, as Jeff was alluding to, Lehman probably wouldn't have happened the way it did had Bear Stearns been allowed to go down. Dick Fowler would have made different decisions during that 6-month interval. But anyway, so I think the problem the Fed is facing when it does do these things is that the expectations it sets for doing them again. And so when the Fed lowers the bar or makes a decision to intervene in a particular way, expectations get set that they'll do it again. And that makes it very hard for them to say no in the future. The Fed hadn't used Section 13.3 since the Great Depression, except in 1 or 2 cases when it allowed a non-member bank to borrow at the discount window. But other than that, the Fed didn't use the intervention in private security markets when Continental Illinois failed. It didn't do it when you had the stock market crash in '87. It didn't do it in the NASDAQ crash in 2000, 2001. It didn't do it under the terrorist attacks on 9/11. In none of those cases did the Fed use its powers under Section 13.3 to lend directly to private individuals and companies. It didn't use that. Now, they broke a long-standing tradition of not relying on that provision and that type of lending. I think that will prove to be a decision that's going to be very hard to unwind and bad for the institution and its independence. That's my take.
Well, Jeff, when Congress looked at what happened during the great financial crisis and wrote the Dodd-Frank Act, the regional Fed banks banded together to lobby to try to keep a certain amount of power to do some of those emergency things. Where do you stand on this? Does the Fed need that ability? Would it be better to be proscribed or better to have the option to react to the situation as it arises?
So the Dodd-Frank Act embodies at least 2, maybe more several different theories about the crisis. And one of them is we need more tools. That wasn't the Fed needs more tools to deal with these things, or the government needs more tools. That wasn't a universal view within the system. It was strongly held view in Washington and New York, some other places too. So the Fed was able to retain some lending authority in 13.3, but it was bounded around with, wrapped around with some accountability measures, which I think were really good. It's still a lending authority that's big enough to drive an LLC through. I should say, I was going to say truck through, but drive the biggest special purpose vehicle you can imagine through, and it can be used to bail out a single institution. It says it has to be broad-based availability, but it doesn't say that it can't be the case that only one bank shows up to borrow, or one entity shows up to borrow. For my money, I would have provided a little more clarity around the use of central bank and treasury credit to insulate the creditors of failing institutions from losses. And we can go to the early liquidation authority is a big contraption, but it allows funneling money in to let short-term creditors get out. And I think that the incentives the Fed and the FDIC have been under for years, decades, has led to this asymmetry with regard to the liabilities of failing financial institutions. What we rescue is the short-term creditors. The Fed lends, that lets the FDIC delay closure. And so short-term creditors get their money out. The long-term creditors are stuck sharing the loss with the FDIC or whatever. And I think in large part, this tremendous liquidity and fluidity of short-term wholesale funding markets is kind of fueled at the end of the day by a sense that the Fed is there as a backstop for all this stuff. And I think that's given rise to the need for an incredible apparatus. What the Reserve Banks did band together to really focus on was supervisory authority for community banks. And this is something that was also something where there was a difference of views within the system. Tim Geithner famously, within the system, kind of asked our opinion, I think it was in 2007 or so. Well, how about if we just regulated the top 50 banks? And some of the regional reserve banks, that's a big part of their connection to the banking community, financial system, and the economies in, Kansas or, Minnesota or, South Carolina for that matter. So it was something that that there were differences of views. And then there's a whole story about what happened in the beginning of 2010 that changed the board's view on that. But it was around supervisory authority that the Reserve Banks really came together.
I want to ask all of you, and then I'm going to get to some of the viewer questions about quantitative easing. And the big issue as presented about Fed independence is that the central bank would be vulnerable to political pressure to basically monetize debt. And there are people who think that is where you have gone with QE. And the European Central Bank has a Maastricht provision against it, and yet buys an extraordinary amount of debt on a regular basis as well. Does that cross the line? Is it a special case? How do you fit quantitative easing into this whole idea of political independence?
Somebody needs to talk here. All right, Mike, I'll offer a couple comments. In the most recent quantitative easing episode, which is now about to reverse, it was certainly, given the scale of the purchases and the deficit spending that was associated with response to COVID and so forth, certainly a cursory look at it would suggest that the Fed was monetizing the debt. And I've got many questions from members of the public about whether this was the intent of the Fed, and whether the Fed was in league with the fiscal side to do this, and even whether there was an experiment, or even more than an experiment, in modern monetary theory going on. And I found myself trying to explain at a little more subtle level that the Fed buys treasuries in the secondary market. They can buy original issue MBS, but the Fed is not there at the auctions of. That may be a distinction that's not a big difference, but nonetheless, it is not exactly buying the debt when issued. And that the coincidence of those two things really related to the economic circumstances the Fed was trying to deal with, largely within its mandate. So I think the public and the political perception of this is very fraught. But again, I don't think the decisions were necessarily bad decisions.
If I could, Mike. So the Fed always monetizes debt. The question is how much and to what end. In the case of the Fed in the 1940s, it was to keep the government's borrowing costs down. That's the ever-present issue then. But for Truman, in 1951, it was about keeping small business borrowing costs down. It was about keeping interest rates down in the whole economy. So I think of the pressure to monetize debt out of fiscal concerns for the federal government as, one of an array of considerations that lead people to want lower interest rates than they otherwise would, than otherwise would be the case. And to the extent that higher interest rates choke off demand, which is sort of what they're designed to do, they're going to reduce spending and reduce employment growth. Raising interest rates are going to be unpopular on that dimension as well. So I kind of think of them all as a piece of just an array of forces, political forces, arrayed against taking what are at times unpopular actions and raising interest rates. Right now, it doesn't seem as if the federal government is terribly constrained by the interest cost on debt. There might be some optical constraints, but the demand for U.S. securities, from global sources is just so tremendous, and has been for the last couple of decades, that I'm not sure I see that kind of arising as a politically cogent concern soon, apart from the general political resistance that raising rates is going to at some point run into, I think.
Although, Charlie, the Fed has been remitting an awful lot of money back to the Treasury for a decade or so, and it wasn't that long ago that Congress decided to use some of your capitalization for roads. Is that an exception, or has the Fed sort of put a honeypot out there that is going to attract the bees from Capitol Hill?
I think one of the problems of QE and one of the consequences of the Fed's choice of policies and the way they've chosen to implement is it has led to this, from a balance sheet that once was under $1 trillion to one that's 9 trillion or whatever it is now, and growing. I think that my concerns have been since the beginning of this is that partly the way the Fed has managed this, and I'm going to call it, for lack of a better phrase, what the Fed does, which is an ample reserve system, that the large balance sheet is now out there. It exists, and it is ripe for political abuse. whether that means the Congress, as it did in 2015, and a few other times, Congress sees that pile of money and says, that's ours. We want some of it to do spending. Or like in terms of the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau, Congress chose to say the feds are going to fund that, which effectively made that political decision, made it so that there was no longer appropriations, that it was funded out of the Fed's, quote, profits. Now, of course, the taxpayer still paid for that, because that just meant the Fed turned over less profits. But as an accountability issue, it was quite mistaken from my point of view, because again, it turned an appropriation into a spending by the Fed, which is off-budget spending. So I think that the danger here is that the bigger the Fed's balance sheet is the more open it's going to be for abuse. If you look at some countries, take Switzerland right now. Switzerland right now has a balance sheet that's now over 100% of GDP. It's now under incredible political pressure to convert its balance sheet and do things with its balance sheet, everything from funding green energy sources to buying stocks in Swiss companies, to funding pension plans, to you name it, all sorts of pressures to use that balance sheet for political objectives. I don't think that's far behind in the United States. I think there's a very real risk that we'll see Congress and other parties and self-interested parties wanting to find a way to exploit the Fed's balance sheet. I want to add just one addendum to what Jeff said about the CARES Act. One of the things that I have argued about, as we mentioned earlier, was this notion that a lot of this lending could have been done by the Treasury. There was no program, no 13.3 program started in the pandemic subsequent, and even for the financial crisis, that couldn't have been done by the Treasury. None of them required the Fed's participation. And a good example that we saw in the pandemic was the Paycheck Protection Program, which was a lending program funded by Congress, established by Congress, and the Fed was not the lender and was not directly involved in it. So I think the point is that these programs can be done with some alacrity and can be done, implemented by the Treasury. And it would be better off if that's how it comes about. And if it can't come about that way, why my argument was that whatever the Fed does, it should be immediately relieved of those securities and given treasuries, if you will, exchanged for treasuries, so that the Fed's balance sheet maintains what I like to think of as an all treasuries portfolio. And the Treasury and Congress maintain control and execution of credit programs. So I think that can be done. So in any event, I think that quantitative easing has other political risks other than just funding the debt, which, as Jeff says, Fed's always doing anyway. In some sense, it's a question of how much. And certainly the funding of borrowing by the Treasury as a percentage of how much they're borrowing and as a percentage of the public debt has risen considerably over the last decade. So in some sense, they are funding more of the deficit, if you will, than they have certainly since World War II. So I think that it's not hard for the public to link those two things together, but buying debt is buying debt.
I want to get into some of the audience questions, and we have a couple of questions on social issues. Dennis, since you brought it up, I'll start with you. One thing that current members of the committee seem to be sensitive to is, and I'll put it this way, we have an inflation problem, and the Fed has to take action to deal with inflation. But as Jeff pointed out earlier, you end up crimping demand, which then crimps production, which then has an effect on unemployment. And if you're Black or Hispanic, if you're Asian, or even women, the last in, first out principle often applies, and you're talking about their jobs. So what do you say to them when they want to at least bring their concerns to the central bank?
Well, I think the central bank clearly has to be sensitive and listen to all facets of society, and including the various employment cohorts. I think an economist today would respond that we have some unusual circumstances in that we have so much demand for labor that it is plausible that inflation can be addressed, and with some luck on the supply side, actually brought down without the normal, or let's just say the theoretical normal of an employment killing slowdown of some kind. That we just have an unusual coincidence of circumstances with high inflation, but a labor market that's in short supply. So I think the answer to the groups that you described in current circumstances can be somewhat comforting. That doesn't mean every time this kind of thing occurs, there isn't risk to employment. In the recession, the Great Recession that followed the financial crisis, when we dropped interest rates to effectively zero, and I got the question over and over again, particularly from a different cohort, retired people, you're killing me, or what are you doing? You know, I can't live on this. I didn't have a good answer except to say that the decisions we're making are in the best interests of the overall economy. And we're trying as a group to preserve economic strength that is in everyone's interest. And that's about as good an answer as you can give.
The other aspect of social policy that a lot of people are asking about and concerned about, and I'll go to Jeff for this one, or at least to start, if others want to weigh in, they can, is climate change. There's two things. One, the Fed has a supervisory duty, obviously, to make sure that banks aren't lending to developments that are under 6 feet of water. But at the same time, there's a feeling that this is an existential problem for society, and that perhaps it is a duty to get more involved in something like that, because the whole economy could be jeopardized. Your thoughts, Mr. Lockhart?
You're right that the Fed certainly has a responsibility to ensure that the financial entities for which it has supervisory responsibility and regulatory responsibility are evaluating the risks soundly and fairly, and are cognizant of those risks. From that point of view, though, climate is one of an array of risks. And if you look at the scenarios involved, the risks to financial institutions are likely to materialize on a gradual basis over years. But sure, highlighting that, I have no problem with that. But more broadly, using our asset purchases or private credit market lending programs to direct the flow of credit, or pressuring institutions to go beyond risk considerations alone. Risks involving the Fed in essentially in issues, policy questions for which there is partisan disagreement or even nonpartisan disagreement, and which could be handled quite well by Congress itself. So again, I'm always wary of arguments that the Fed should do something because the political system seems, too coagulated to deal with. And I think, as a matter of general principle, for the role of a central bank in a constitutional democracy, I think that's a really slippery slope to go down. So, I'd be wary of going beyond our usual safety and soundness considerations in this case.
Oh, let me.
Charlie, you're on mute.
Charlie, you've muted yourself.
I'm sorry. Maybe I should have. Maybe I should have stayed muted. In any event, I want to tie this back to something I said at the very beginning, and that is the danger of whether it be, let me call it the hubris of the Fed or of Fed watchers, the danger of asking the Fed to do things that it is not well suited to do or can't achieve. Many of the problems with these kind of broader, vague mandates is that it leaves the Fed in a spot where it has the ability to pick and choose policies, making all sorts of its own decisions about what are the most important or what to focus on. Are we making this policy because of this desire, climate change, or this gap in employment, or this some other purpose? And the more dimensions under which the Fed has the discretion to make its policies and frame their policies in the context of some of these cases where it really doesn't have much control or ability to make those desires successful, it undermines their own credibility and undermines their ability to pay attention to the things that in fact can control. So this notion of broadening the mandates or making the mandates more vague, I believe, is a disservice to the Fed, and it creates the perception in the public that the Fed has more control over a lot of these things than in fact it does. And I don't think that's healthy. And so I think that's why when I started out this panel, I was talking about what are the appropriate constraints where you can hold the Fed accountable for its actions, or is it the old say, responsible for everything and accountable for nothing? And I think we're in publicly, we're in danger of expecting the Fed to do far more than it's capable of doing, and that's not healthy for the institution or the economy.
A lot of talk about the Fed's tools in recent years, and we have a question from somebody wondering if it would scare you to be given the authority to be able to expand what you can purchase in the way that the Bank of Japan has bought ETFs, the European Central Bank has. The Fed did buy corporate bonds in the secondary market on an index basis. Is that a slippery slope, or would that be helpful at times to have that power? Dennis?
I think that's a very good constraint. And I think if you were to liberalize that dramatically so that the Fed could buy any securities out there, and I remember in the discussion at the beginning of the first QE program, Ben Bernanke talking about the academic studies and academic discussion of quantitative easing was much more contingent in those days, hadn't been used, that you could, in theory, buy anything, foreign sovereigns or real estate or whatever. I think this has to be defined and to be defined fairly narrowly, or every problem that has a credit dimension, you're going to have someone beating a track to the Fed to try to solve it.
Jeff, would you want broader tools than the Fed has at the moment?
I think the Fed has too many tools as it is. I think its number one mission is price stability, and you can add maximum employment to that. But I think that the chairman has articulated well why price stability is the best contribution the Fed can make to maximum employment. For that, I think that its liabilities are its main and a perfectly sufficient tool. So on the asset side, let's have the Fed hold treasuries and nothing else. I think that would be just fine.
Before we go, we're running low on time.
Okay.
Oh, Charlie, you want to make a quick comment?
Well, I was going to say, I agree with Dennis. I think the Fed ought to be constrained to an all treasuries portfolio. Imagine, just to illustrate this, imagine if the Fed could buy ETFs, stocks, bonds, or sovereigns, go down the list. Imagine what confirmation hearings for governors might look like. The conversation will center around, well, don't you think you ought to be investing in green energy? Or don't you think you ought to be investing in the sports industry? Or tech industries? There will be lobbying from all corners of the economy to lobby the Fed and lobby Congress to have the Fed buy certain things. That would be an utter disaster. And it would be a political nightmare. And that's kind of what's happening in Switzerland right now. And I think we should not go down that road. It is talk about politicizing the Fed. That would be a surefire way to do it, in my view.
Right. Again, we only have a few minutes left, so if we could keep the answers to the next couple of questions short. Personnel is power, is the saying in Washington, and there has been talk of changing the way regional Fed bank presidents are chosen, to give either Congress a veto power or to put the choice of the regional president in the president's hands. I'm going to guess that, I'll start with you, Dennis, that you probably don't like that idea?
No, because it further politicizes the appointment of people who are going to be at the FOMC table. I understand there is a criticism of democratic accountability on the part of Fed presidents who are appointed by a local board of directors, that the appointment of which itself is somewhat arcane. Having said that, for 10 years, I was able to go to the table with no political concerns whatsoever, nobody to answer to, just try to make the best decision and participate in a process that did that. I think you would end up, I want to be a little bit crass here, you would end up with political hacks in those jobs.
Jeff, you're not a political hack. But,
thank you.
You agree with
nice
Dennis?
For all day. Yeah, I totally agree with Dennis. The Reserve Bank presidents have, throughout the Fed's history, at crucial times played a kind of a role as ballast for against, and I think it's particularly important in light of the fact that governors, even though they're appointed to 14-year terms, tend to serve for like 2, 3, 4 years at best at times. And with so much turnover at the Board of Governors, I think preserving the apolitical nature of the Reserve Bank presidential appointments is important.
I've got a million questions, but there is one good last question that I'll paraphrase here. I started off by asking you about whether the Fed finds itself dragged into political controversy by the things that it has to deal with. And you all mentioned the idea that there are growing political threats to the Fed, but I go back to Henry Gonzalez is when I started covering the Fed, and he wanted to take you guys apart. So is it ever thus? Is there something that particularly worries you right now about the Fed and its political independence. Charlie, let's start with you.
Well, I think that the things that we've already touched on. I think credit policy, I think, is a serious risk to the Fed in terms of Congress or administrations or the public wanting the Fed to do things it's not well suited to do and make political decisions. And the other side is, and these are things that, and the other side is the large balance sheet, which I think is ripe for political abuse, which concerns me. And my fear is the Fed doesn't seem to be that concerned about it, but it should be. So I think credit policy and the large balance sheet and how they interact with one another are very dangerous arenas right now for the Fed.
Dennis, what would keep you up at night about politics and the Fed?
There's always some amount of risk to independence because there's always a cohort on Capitol Hill that for one reason or another either is resentful of the independence or has sometimes legitimate criticisms. Having said that, as long as the Fed chair and the governors spend time explaining the institution and its decisions to members of Congress, it has been, I haven't done this a lot myself, or I did not do it a lot myself, but it's my understanding that behind closed doors, there is more respect than you get in public commentary for Fed independence. And therefore, I would say we probably have not reached a critical point in that respect.
Yes.
Biggest concern I have about Fed independence is self-inflicted wounds. You go back to Arthur Burns, and he was complicit in the compromise of Fed independence. Miller to some extent as well under Carter. And I think in the last decade and a half, the damage to the Fed's independence has been in part self-inflicted.
Do you think, Jeff, that facing the test that they do now, and you sort of made the case that this is something that we haven't really seen since the Volcker years, that this current Fed is going to be able to rise to that challenge?
I think so. I think they have some things going for them. I think that the inflation target that Charlie was very instrumental in kind of negotiating within the FOMC that we adopted in January of 2012 is one signature difference between now and the 60s and 70s, and it's worth highlighting that. I think that puts the Fed in a better position. I think it to both withstand the shocks and to cement political coalition around maintaining price stability. So I think they have the tools to fare better this time around than in the late 1960s.
Well, I want to thank you all for participating, and just to make you feel like you're sort of back in the game here, let me finish with one question. When are you going to raise interest rates? Make you feel like the old days.
Yeah. How about March?
Does anybody here?
How about last July?
Yeah, there you go.
Does anybody here think that the Fed is way behind the curve and needs to move much quicker?
You should ask whether anyone does it.
Does anyone disagree with that idea? All right. Well, we'd like to thank very much Jeff Flacker, Dennis Lockhart, and Charlie Plosser, all members of the GIC's College of Central Bankers, for joining us today. And I think, Peter Gold, we're going to have to do this again because there's a million questions out there, and I could go on forever with these guys, and it's been terrific. And we'd like to thank everybody for tuning in today.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much. Thank you all. I totally agree. This has to be continued. We could spend so much more time on this topic. And at the College of Central Bankers, we will be spending more time on this topic because it is one of the 5 lenses we are looking at, something called our Institutional Alignment Project. But for today, for right now, Dennis, Charlie, Jeff, Mike, thank you for a fascinating discussion and a very candid discussion, which is extremely important at this time. We hope each of you will be able to join us for another program soon. I'd again like to acknowledge and thank today's event sponsors, Rowan University and Gold Aller, for their support. Without support, we can't do these types of things, and we again thank them and appreciate it. As a reminder, before we close, a replay of today's executive briefing will be available on the GIC's website tomorrow. We're excited to announce the next College of Central Bankers executive briefing will be in partnership with the Americas Center at the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta. On March 30th, we'll be joined by college fellow and former governor of the Central Bank of Chile, Jose Di Gregorio, and former governor of the Central Bank of Argentina, Guido Sandelares. Registration is available now on the GIC website. To find other video replays, or to explore membership in the GIC, which we encourage you please to join us, and learn more about the College of Central Bankers, please go to our website at www.interdependence.org, or contact our fantastic staff or reach out to me, and always happy to chat. As we conclude, we encourage you to take 30 seconds to respond to our audience survey. Your feedback is so very important to us, and we appreciate you letting us know how we can improve our programming. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for attending. Have a wonderful day and good evening. Thank you.